The Zalzir Empire had conquered over 100 worlds. Their war fleets, vast and merciless, left nothing but submission in their wake. Every species they encountered had bowed before their technological might. Some fought, some resisted, none prevailed. When their scouts first discovered humanity, the Zalzir barely considered them worth the effort. A fledgling race, isolated on the edge of the galaxy, with no known history of interstellar war. Their colonies were sparse, their fleets insignificant. A single Zalzir battle group could reduce Earth's defenses to ash in hours. The decision was made swiftly. The Zalzir would invade. Not for survival, not for necessity, simply because they could. Humans were to be conquered and integrated into the Empire, as all others had before them. The High Command saw no risk. The first target was Epsilon Eridani IV, a prosperous human colony. It was chosen deliberately, far enough from Earth that reinforcements would be delayed, but significant enough to send a message. The invasion fleet, a force of overwhelming strength, arrived in system without warning. They expected shock and terror. Instead, they were met with silence. Planetary defenses activated, but the Zalzir swatted them aside with ease. Orbital bombardments reduced human strongholds to rubble within hours. The Zalzir ground forces, numbering in the tens of thousands, were deployed without hesitation. Victory was inevitable. Their dropships descended over cities, expecting chaos and surrender. They found neither. Zalzir war doctrine was simple: overpower resistance, establish control, and demand submission. It had worked on every species they had encountered. Humanity, they assumed, would be no different. But something felt wrong. As the first squads moved through the ruined streets, they found them empty. No civilians. No retreating soldiers. Only silence. This was not the panicked retreat they had expected. It was something else. Then the first attack came. Explosions tore through Zalzir formations, ripping apart squads before they could react. Sniper fire picked off officers with brutal efficiency. Their soldiers fired back blindly, but there was no visible enemy, only shadows moving between the ruins. The Zalzir commanders dismissed it as minor resistance. Annoying but inconsequential. More troops were deployed, armor divisions rolled through the streets, and scouting teams were sent ahead. They never reported back. What should have been a swift occupation turned into a creeping nightmare. The Zalzir advanced, but with every step forward, their numbers dwindled. Their energy weapons, superior in open combat, were near useless in the tight corridors of collapsed buildings. Meanwhile, human forces struck with unrelenting precision, disappearing before retaliation could come. Communication between units became difficult. Signals were jammed, and every attempt to coordinate met with eerie static. The Zalzir relied on structured formations, clear orders, and centralized leadership. But here, in the ruins of a human city, none of it mattered. Panic began to spread. The Zalzir had fought wars before, but this was different. Their enemies had always resisted openly, using predictable tactics, meeting them in direct combat. The humans fought like no species they had encountered. There was no clear front line, no vulnerable command centers to strike. Only endless, relentless attacks from an enemy that refused to engage on Zalzir terms. They called for reinforcements. More troops landed. More firepower was brought to bear. Yet nothing changed. The city itself seemed to turn against them. Booby traps lined every street, supply routes were sabotaged, and their own vehicles were hijacked and used against them. Every attempt to regroup was met with another sudden, brutal ambush. Zalzir soldiers, once arrogant, now moved with hesitation. Their armor, their training, their weapons, none of it seemed to matter. Their numbers, once overwhelming, were being whittled down. Then the psychological attacks began. Faint voices echoed through their comms. Human transmissions, distorted and taunting. The screams of their own dying soldiers played back to them. False orders lured squads into kill zones. Night patrols reported seeing figures in the dark, always just out of reach, always watching. Fear took root. The Zalzir were not built for this kind of war. They were conquerors, not survivors. They thrived in battles of dominance, not drawn-out conflicts of attrition. Every day, their forces dwindled. Every night, more soldiers disappeared without a trace. For the first time in Zalzir history, an invasion stalled. The High Command, still overconfident, refused to acknowledge the problem. They ordered their generals to push forward, to break human resistance with overwhelming force. They still believed victory was inevitable. They did not yet understand the true nature of the enemy they had awakened. The Zalzir generals dismissed the resistance as nothing more than an inconvenience. Their forces still controlled the skies, their warships dominated orbit, and their troops outnumbered the enemy 10-1. From a strategic standpoint, victory remained inevitable. They simply needed to apply more force. Yet the war was not going as planned. Every day, their casualties mounted. Every attempt to push forward resulted in more lost units. The enemy never met them in direct combat, never engaged in open battle. Instead, they attacked from angles the Zalzir had never trained for, striking and vanishing like phantoms. Frustration turned to confusion. Confusion turned to unease. The war doctrine of the Zalzir revolved around swift, decisive action. Prolonged engagements favored the enemy, especially one as adaptable as humanity. Human forces did not fight to hold territory. They fought to make every step forward cost the Zalzir dearly. Streets that had been clear hours before were suddenly riddled with explosives. Buildings thought to be abandoned became death traps, collapsing onto squads without warning. The city itself was an extension of the battlefield, and the humans controlled every inch of it. Supply chains were another problem. The Zalzir relied on precision logistics, tightly coordinated convoys, scheduled resupply drops, carefully maintained distribution networks. The humans dismantled all of it with terrifying efficiency. Ambushes destroyed armored columns before they could reach the front. Supply depots were raided or sabotaged. Entire stockpiles detonated in controlled demolitions. Even rations were compromised, some contaminated, others stolen entirely. Within days, soldiers began rationing their own provisions. The lucky ones received food. The unlucky ones found their storage units empty, their supplies missing. Worse still, the Zalzir were not used to prolonged engagements without reinforcement. Their war machine functioned on overwhelming initial strikes, not drawn-out conflicts where every unit had to operate with minimal support. Morale cracked. It wasn't just the deaths. The Zalzir had lost soldiers before. They understood casualties. But this war wasn't just about numbers, it was about control. And for the first time, they had none. Communication breakdowns made coordination nearly impossible. Some messages never reached their recipients. Others were intercepted and altered. Orders were misinterpreted, units were led into traps by false transmissions, and attempts to counter the humans only resulted in more losses. Every advantage the Zalzir had relied upon was crumbling. The worst part wasn't the battlefield itself. It was the waiting. Patrols that ventured into the ruins often never returned. Those that did were haunted, rambling, incoherent, muttering about enemies that saw them before they could react, of death that came without warning. There were no bodies left behind, only the knowledge that they had been there one moment and gone the next. Zalzir forces began to hesitate. Soldiers who once moved with precision now second-guessed every step. They avoided dark corners, checked every shadow, refused to travel alone. The sounds of distant footsteps, whether real or imagined, sent squads into a panic. Some fired wildly at empty spaces, only to find nothing but silence in return. And then the humans escalated. Their tactics grew bolder. Snipers didn't just take down officers, they severed command structures. The Zalzir chain of command disintegrated as high-ranking leaders were methodically eliminated. Those who remained became paranoid, afraid to speak over comms, afraid to even show themselves. Then came the night assaults. The Zalzir were not nocturnal by nature. Their vision adapted poorly in low light, their technology optimized for conventional battlefield conditions. Humanity had no such limitations. The attacks came in waves. Explosions lighting up the darkness, figures moving in the chaos, eliminating entire units before they could retaliate. Soldiers woke to find their comrades missing, their weapons stolen, their defenses breached. Terror set in. This was no longer a war. It was a massacre, stretched out over days, drawn into weeks. The Zalzir had started this campaign believing themselves untouchable, believing that the war was already won. Now, they only wanted to escape, but there was nowhere to run. The High Command finally understood that something was wrong. Reports from the ground had gone from overconfident declarations of victory to fragmented distress calls. Entire battalions had gone dark. Attempts to re-establish control had failed. This was no longer an occupation. It was a disaster. Reinforcements were sent, doubling the number of troops on the surface. Heavier armor, more firepower, stricter orders. Everything was designed to crush whatever resistance remained. The Zalzir believed that more numbers would fix what strategy could not. Didn't. The new arrivals landed into a war zone they didn't understand. Their briefings had told them that humans were a lesser species, that they lacked the ability to resist an empire as vast as the Zalzir. Yet from the moment they set foot on the planet, they knew the briefings had been wrong. There were no front lines, no safe zones, no clear objectives, only war. The veterans who had survived the first wave of battles no longer carried the arrogance of conquest. Their armor was damaged, their weapons scavenged for human modifications. They moved differently now, less like an organized army, more like cornered animals. The new soldiers ignored them at first, assuming their fear was weakness. Then they heard the whispers, false orders transmitted through their comms, distorted voices echoing in the ruins, the laughter of something unseen. They realized, too late, that they had been thrown into a nightmare. The humans no longer fought for survival. They fought for dominance. Their attacks came faster, more brutal than before. Entire squads were wiped out before they even knew they were in danger. The reinforcements were supposed to stabilize the war effort, yet they were being slaughtered even faster than the first wave. The Zalzir tried to escalate. They deployed airstrikes, believing that overwhelming firepower could erase their enemy. It only made things worse. The humans had adapted. Their jamming technology had improved, turning precision bombardments into chaotic misfires. Zalzir ships found themselves firing on their own troops, guided by data that had been corrupted without their knowledge. Desperation set in. The Empire issued the order for total war. No more warnings. No more attempts at control. The city was to be leveled, its ruins turned to glass if necessary. But the humans had planned for this. As the first high-yield strikes landed, key Zalzir command centers were hit simultaneously. Not by human artillery, by their own. Hacked targeting systems had turned their own weapons against them. The chaos was instant. Officers shouted contradictory orders. Fleets scrambled to realign their attacks, and ground forces found themselves cut off from command. Then the real slaughter began. Human strike teams moved through the wreckage with surgical precision. They carried weapons modified from captured Zalzir tech, their armor reinforced with salvaged plating. They fought with no hesitation, no mercy. And the Zalzir broke. Squads abandoned their posts. Officers went silent. Soldiers who had once boasted of their superiority now ran without looking back. They had come to conquer. Now they were the ones being hunted. The retreat was not planned. It was not strategic. It was chaos. Zalzir forces had never experienced true terror before. They had crushed countless civilizations, erased entire histories, and rewritten the fate of species without resistance. Their empire had never known defeat. Now defeat was all they knew. Survivors staggered back to their remaining strongholds, their numbers decimated, their leaders dead. Those who could still fight did so only out of fear. Not of their commanders, not of failure, of the enemy that lurked in the ruins, watching, waiting. Evacuation orders came, but there was no coordination. Dropships landed only to be shot down moments later. Others lifted off full of wounded soldiers, only to find their navigational systems corrupted, sending them crashing back into the battlefield. Human forces had hijacked the Zalzir network. The Empire's own machines had turned against them. Those who made it off-world did so through sheer luck. They fled in damaged vessels, abandoning their comrades, desperate to escape. But escape was not the end. When the first surviving warships reached Zalzir space, they carried more than just the wounded. They carried fear. They carried knowledge. And knowledge, the High Command realized, was far worse than casualties. Humanity had been underestimated. Not just as warriors, but as a species. The Empire had assumed they were weak because they had not expanded far. They had assumed humans lacked the will to fight because they had never waged interstellar war. They had assumed a great many things. Now they understood. Humanity had spent millennia perfecting war. Long before they ever reached the stars, they had fought themselves, adapting to every form of conflict imaginable. Where the Zalzir had crushed weaker species with superior firepower, humans had evolved through endless warfare. Every lesson in strategy, in deception, in brutality, they had learned it long before they ever met the Empire. And now they were aware of the Zalzir. The High Command convened in secrecy. They debated retaliation, countermeasures, ways to reassert dominance. But they knew the truth. There would be no counterattack. The war had not ended with a battle. It had ended with a warning. Then the final transmission arrived. It was not intercepted. It was not forced through hacked networks. It was sent directly to the Empire's highest council, on a secure channel thought to be unbreakable. A single human voice spoke, calm, measured, unshaken. You started this war. We will finish it. The message ended. And for the first time in their history, the Zalzir understood what it meant to be prey.